These things exist. They're in the
Hmm.
U.S. They're overseas. They're all over the place. They could be, in SIM boxes. Those pieces of equipment with blinking lights and antennas that are, produced and shipped out of China and smuggled into the United States, disguised as other pieces of equipment to make it through customs. That can have 128 SIMs in them and launch thousands and thousands of messages, remote control on a server overseas.
Hmm.
It's literally messaging originating inside the wireless networks, but remotely controlled.
We are the Keyboard Samurai, a podcast about the business of cyber and tech, here to help you or your business improve. Here's your host, Wil Klu. Let's hack into it now.
Hey, everybody, welcome back. Another great episode. As always, like, subscribe, all that good stuff. Today, I'm joined by Ian. Ian, why don't you give everybody the 20-second, 30-second spiel of who you are and why we care?
Thanks, Will. Thanks for having me. So I'm Ian Matthews. I'm a founder, entrepreneur, cybersecurity executive, focused on the intersection of telco, cyber, and AI. I'm currently the founder and president of WMC Global, which is a CTI company that detects, disrupts, attributes mobile threats and the resultant fraud from that activity. My career dates back to the early days of SMS and SMS interoperability. So I actually worked for the company that launched SMS interoperability in the United States. So in the days when if you wanted to send a text message to your buddy, you had to have the latest and giant Nokia brick phone technology. They had to have similar tech, and you had to be on the same wireless carrier. There was no inter-carrier connectivity in those days. And so we built a lot of the plumbing to make that possible and sort of help to bring mobile messaging into what it is today. So I apologize for all those political text messages and some of the other stuff that you get on your device you don't like. But I think that's a really good example of how technology growth and expansion also enables threat actors to do nasty things. So I spent a lot of my time today advising senior leaders and boards on what they should care about at that telco intersection with cyber and AI, and all the things that could be happening and are happening out there that they should be getting ahead of.
Awesome. I think we're going to have some fun. Having worked for a telco and worked for as a subcontractor, a couple telcos. And well, you mentioned the thing, just that I'm going to go down a rabbit hole to begin with. But when you said the SMS thing, I remember, was it like 2020 or 2021? There was a bank in Singapore. They got they were held liable, like somebody, because you can spoof SMS like really easily. And I think they were held liable for a bunch of people losing some money.
Well, it's interesting because there's different market dynamics in each market, right?
Mm-hmm.
And Singapore has a pretty heavily regulated market, but you say you can spoof text messaging pretty easily. That's not necessarily true. It depends on what market you're in. So, for example, in the United States, it's almost impossible, whereas other international markets and Europe or possibly Singapore, you can. And so it really depends on the tech stack and
Mm-hmm.
what local controls are in place and what local regulations are in place. And then from that regulatory standpoint, who's held responsible? And it's really interesting to see what those regulatory differences look like in different markets. In the US, depending on the political administration, it can be quite punitive.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's a financial incentive for telco organizations to invest in new technology. In other markets, it's more collaborative. And so it's a different type of incentive. And sometimes it works better and sometimes it doesn't. So it's really interesting to look at how that pans out across the globe, because it's definitely very different depending on what country you're in.
Nice. Well, so I was under the impression that, and when I say spoof, so I was under the impression the old school SMS, the stuff that's like incredibly insecure, like anybody can go out there and make their message look like it's coming from somebody else.
No, not true.
Okay.
So in the States, you can do that with a telephone number
Right.
for voice calls, right? But for voice calls, for text messages, you can't, and for
Okay.
short codes, you can't. Now, there are all kinds of different pieces of technology that underpin this, and so there are certain cases where there was a software update, there was a hardware update, and there's a small exploit that some threat actor figures out that's open for a period of time that could enable something that either looks like spoofing or it could be defined as spoofing. But for the most part in the States, you can't spoof a text message. And I think that's an important point because I think the term spoofing is also used to describe multiple things. A lot of times it's used to describe pretending to be a brand that you're not, as opposed to making it look like the telephone number on your phone is coming from a legitimate source when it's actually coming from a threat actor.
Right. Well, so let's go. So yeah, like it's easy for me to get a Gmail account and put the name as Verizon, right? And as
Right.
if you don't look at the email, and I think the same thing you're saying with the phone number and text message too. But the idea, so the idea is like you can't, I guess from the what can you do from the SMS side? Because I was under the impression you could just download like some server and then like you could make it look like you were Chase Bank all day long and start asking people for their passwords.
Well, you can certainly send a text message and say, Chase Bank alert, your account's been locked. Click this link, call this phone number, respond to this text from any number, that you want that you can get a hold of, right? I think one of the things that a lot of folks don't think about is there's a ton of different ways that a text message can hit your device. In fact, there's a ton of different types of text messages. So, when your average consumer thinks about receiving a text message, they're generally thinking about a message that comes to the native messaging application on their phone, their Android or their iOS device. If they use WhatsApp or Snapchat, they view those differently, but they view a regular text message from that native messaging app as the same thing. But you've got SMS, you've got MMS, you've got email to SMS, you've got text-enabled landline, you've got text-enabled 800 number, you've got application to person, you've got P2P, peer-to-peer, person-to-person. Now you've got RCS, which is where the real wrinkle comes in because that traffic is then end-to-end encrypted. And this is where it starts to get really interesting because all those other things I mentioned before RCS, those are not encrypted. And so, and you're thinking about that probably from a threat vector perspective. I'm thinking about it from the fact that the wireless carriers put firewalls inside their networks to look at that traffic and identify when it looks like fraud. And you have companies like Proofpoint, right, that sit in the mobile networks, and they've got 10 to 100 milliseconds to make a blocking decision. And there's a lot they can do in that time. And there's actually a lot they do. Contrary to what people think when messages hit their device and they say the carriers aren't doing anything, there's actually a lot they're doing. But in 2024, in September, when iOS 18 came out and Apple enabled support for RCS, which we never thought they would do a few years earlier, all of a sudden, by June of 2025, it's something like 82% of devices supported RCS. And now it's even higher. So almost the entire market now supports RCS. So we've seen this huge shift in threat actor activity off of those channels that are unencrypted into encrypted channels like RCS and also into iMessage. And what that means is the wireless carriers can't see it. It doesn't actually cross their network. It actually crosses Google's network because they run the backbone for RCS in most markets. And so it's now invisible. There's no in-transit filtering. And threat actors figured this out. And since they figured out, a decade earlier that mobile messaging has a 98% open rate within 90 seconds, they know they've got a captive audience. They know this isn't email anymore. They know that they can get a lot more messages through. And so we've also seen this shift where there's this combination of this encrypted messaging and also this shift to more generic scams. So it's not just Chase Bank scams anymore. Not that it only was, but there's been a bigger shift in these generic scams. We started to see it over COVID with the package delivery scams, right? Because everybody was expecting an Amazon package. But now it's expanded beyond that, and it's expanded into toll road violations,
I've gotten
parking violations. Everybody's gotten those texts. And the reason those are so successful is A, the wireless carriers can't see them and filter them. And B, they're so generic, nobody's really responsible for them, or at least stepping up to take responsibility because those scams are collecting personal information, credit information, bank information from dozens and dozens, hundreds of different financial institutions per attack. They don't know what you're going to put into them until you do. And so the fraud is actually splintered over a bunch of FIs. So there's no one that can actually go to law enforcement and say, these are my fraud losses directly attributable to these scams. And the toll roads aren't losing money. The state governments that fund the toll roads aren't losing money. There's a bit of brand damage, but no one's actually stopping using them. So everybody's kind of saying, well, who's going to do something about this? And it falls through the cracks. And then you strap on AI, right? Now you've got the ability to generate, messages that look extremely real, extremely quickly, to do very, very quick A/B testing, to pivot your messaging in real time. And now you've got, really, really cool technologies like OpenClaw to orchestrate the whole thing.
Right.
And it's a really interesting dynamic where all of these new technologies that were built for scaling businesses and innovation and consumer privacy are now being turned against us, and we're kind of being left behind.
That's so it is truly encrypted, because when you mentioned the proof point thing, I thought back of the days of like IDS decryption, right, where you tear it apart and look at it before you pass it on. But you're saying it is like the carriers don't have any visibility into the RCS stuff then at all.
None. No, not at all. The only thing that the carriers can do in RCS, and the only thing that makes it different from iMessage, for example, is that it does require a SIM card. So an iMessage, for example, it doesn't actually originate from a telephone number. It originates from an Apple account and it terminates at an Apple account. And the phone number or the email address that's the user ID for the Apple account, it's just an identifier to say who it came from. There is no actual phone number required for that. For RCS, it needs a SIM card. And so these RCS messages are being generated from actual SIM-enabled devices. And so the wireless carriers are involved in provisioning those, and they're connected to cell towers, or they're using Wi-Fi calling connections and going over the top like that. But so the wireless carriers do have an opportunity there if we can identify clusters of activity that are coming from clusters of numbers that are similar type fraud content. You can say, all right, there's this cluster of SIMs that's originating this content within about the same time frame. The wireless carriers can do things. They can look at what cell towers they're coming off of. They can look at what the device IDs are, and there are ways to say, all right, this is a phone farm. We've all seen those images online of phones that look like they're in server racks, and there's thousands of them in a room. These things exist. They're in the U.S. They're overseas. They're all over the place. They could be, in SIM boxes. Those pieces of equipment with blinking lights and antennas that are, produced and shipped out of China and smuggled into the United States, disguised as other pieces of equipment to make it through customs. That can have 128 SIMs in them and launch thousands and thousands of messages, remote control on a server overseas. It's literally messaging originating inside the wireless networks, but remotely controlled. So
I was going to ask you that, because wouldn't it it's funny because I've worked remotely my whole career. So I know almost all the time if a phone rings or I get a text message from my local area code, it's probably a scam. So if they're all originating from a place in India, but you're saying the phones aren't there, they're just remote managing them?
Yeah, exactly. Sometimes they're there, but sometimes they're in a piece of equipment that's cloud enabled, right? It's got a Wi-Fi connection or an Ethernet connection, and you just control it over the internet. So all it needs to be is physically in the country or loaded up with legitimate SIMs, and then those SIMs are the cellular connections turned off, put on Wi-Fi calling, and that actually also makes them invisible to the carriers because it goes through another over-the-top connection. So these are some of the challenges that we're facing. But I think that the technology is there between different industry stakeholders to bring all this data together and to combat this. But we then have regulatory challenges because some of the data the wireless carriers have, they're not necessarily allowed to share because it's governed by CP&I or other regulations. And so you now have this tug of war between consumer privacy that's designed with the best of intent and consumer protection. And so you've got these kind of challenges where, we have the technology, we can do it, but the regulations hold us back. The threat actors are the same. They have the technology, they can do it. They collaborate, they share information. They have training manuals, right? But they don't have those regulatory constraints because they don't care about the rules. And that's the challenge that we face. And until we can break down some of those walls, not just the technical walls, but the regulatory ones, they're going to keep winning.
So that's interesting too, because I think about if somebody could be subpoenaed for their text messages, and back in the day, like Verizon could be like, yeah, here they are because they had them, but with RCS, they can't do that now, right? So now they need the physical phone.
Yeah, exactly. physical phone or access to an iCloud account if they're backing up messages or a a Gmail account if they're backing up messages tied to a Google account. There are different approaches to it, but it's not as simple as just going to the wireless carrier.
Right. Yeah. So I'm thinking, like, from the criminal mindset, that makes it like probably even more enticing because there's less evidence potentially when you do get caught.
100%. 100%. And I think that's part of the challenge that we're facing. The flip side of it is that AI is for better or worse, it's lowered the barrier entry to pretty much nothing to to enter this fraud space. But it means that a lot of those actors that are getting in now that wouldn't have otherwise, they're even less sophisticated, and they're going to make pretty dumb mistakes, which I think is an opportunity for law enforcement and for attribution to go after. And I think all the AI telltale signs are still there with a lot of the stuff that they do. And it's funny. You go on Reddit, with the biggest hater of AI on social media, and they're frothing at the mouth to call out posts in various subreddits about this is AI, this is fake, this is BS, and they're all arguing about whether it's AI or not about all these tells. But you can use those same tells to look at threat actor activity. And I was having a conversation with someone on LinkedIn the other day about a phishing as a service kit that they discovered out in the wild and was being promoted on Telegram. And the interesting point I took from the promotional material, quote unquote, on Telegram was that they referred to targets and victim lists as leads. And it was kind of the first time I'd seen that. Usually they're more brazen than, yeah, they don't care. Yeah, these are victims. We know what we're doing. And they referred to them as leads. And I kind of just sort of made a comment that's really interesting to see that. And what he said back to me was, well, this is probably a tell that it's AI and they're using prompts to write this, but they're pretending they're a marketer so that the AI will actually write it for them, which actually makes total sense. It just didn't occur to me. But when you think about it, scammers are just marketers, right? They're just trying to convince you to click on a link, to put in your credit card information, and to sign up for their thing, except their thing is stealing your data as opposed to some online subscription you didn't really want. It's just marketing. And so if you think about it like that, you kind of get an insight into how to disrupt them as well, because they're just trying to make money, just like everybody else. And if you can make it more expensive to acquire a lead or a customer, then it costs them to do that, right? Then they can take from it, then they can make from each lead, then they're going to go do something else. Now,
Right.
you're not going to convince them to turn over their life of crime and go get a day job.
No.
But as
find it easier
a
that way.
defender of an individual company or customer or brand, you can meet your requirement by looking at it like that, by saying, we just need to make our barrier a little bit higher. We need to make it more expensive for them to run their business,
Just be a hard
illicit as
target.
that business may be.
Yeah,
Exactly.
you don't have to outrun the bear, just the person behind you, right? And I was laughing before because I literally just I had a buddy of mine that we talk about marketing all the time, and we literally had that conversation that we're like, I think there's a YouTube short even that I did that I posted on it. Like, yeah, the thing that makes a good marketing lead magnet email is the same thing that makes a really good phishing email or message. It's exactly the same thing. You're trying to entice the same behavior to get them to click.
Well, it's funny because we are even seeing them use like legitimate marketing tools right now, and there's this interesting emergence of some tools that are actually launching the ability to send sort of mass iMessage with the sort of the marketing pitch that, hey, there's no filters, and it's not subject to the same compliance requirements, and strap it to your CRM. People trust the blue bubble, and it's a really fascinating business model. It reminds me of when companies like Twilio started up, and they just said, you know what, screw the rules. We're going to use regular 10-digit phone numbers, and we're going to go lobby the FCC to tell us it's okay. And they were successful at doing that. Now there's this entire 10DLC messaging ecosystem that's carrier sanctioned now. We're seeing the same thing repeat in iMessage. But the problem is it's end-to-end encrypted and no one can see it. And when a threat actor can just go in with a stolen credit card and sign up for services like that and blast out iMessages, and it's strapped to a CRM and just run a marketing playbook and leverage AI in the back end of that to run a marketing campaign, except it's an illicit marketing campaign. again, it just lowers that barrier now, and all you have to do is understand the basics.
Yeah, and I mean, it doesn't take much to get a clawbot to act like a human and do the interaction. So you really don't even have to do anything at this stage.
No, but I mean, what's interesting to think about, or maybe scary, is you see all these people, right, that are rushing to unplug their claw box because it's not listening anymore, and it's going crazy. It's not doing what they want. So imagine that clawbot that's running all these phishing campaigns and it has access to all this PII and it goes rogue.
Yeah.
I mean, what are the implications of that? I don't know the answer to that, but it's a problem that we're going to have to face pretty soon.
It's not going to be good for anybody. That's for
No.
sure. Well, dude, this was awesome. This is some really cool stuff, man. Where can everybody find you on the interwebs should they want to?
Best place to find me is LinkedIn. And there's my LinkedIn right there. I do read my LinkedIn messages. I do not respond to sales pitches unless they're really, really, really good, and they're usually not. So please don't pitch me.
Yeah, and if you want to know how to get a good sales pitch, you can come to me and I'll teach you how to do that.
There you go.
Ian,
come back when you talk to Will.
Man, I appreciate you.
Appreciate it, Will. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Thanks for listening. Be sure to like and subscribe. Follow Will and the podcast on LinkedIn/Wil Klu. Visit Wil Klu ME for information on services he offers to help your cyber or tech business grow. Until next time, Synaculator.